In 2008, That 90s Show premiered, telling the tale of Homer and Marge's early adulthood, set in that wacky and radical era known as the 1990s. Gone are the days of 70s proms, the LA Olympics, and spoiling The Empire Strikes Back. They have entered the world of Nirvana, Melrose Place, and Amy Rose. Needless to say, the Simpsons fandom was less than pleased by this development. And by less than pleased, I mean numerous negative reviews in the media, registering their disgust on message boards, and I assume, putting Matt Selman's picture on their dartboards. How could The Simpsons do this? Completely rewrite Homer and Marge's backstory? Going back to a time they already spent 10 years in? And for what? A Nirvana parody? That 90s Show was immediately declared one of the worst episodes ever, a poster boy for how the series had lost its way. Even today, it's often cited as proof that the series should have been canceled ages ago. So, are these critics correct? Is That 90s Show the worst Simpsons episode ever? Or were the online fans being, to use the scientific term, whiny piss babies? Let's find out. That 90s Show is especially ambitious in that not only does it have to execute a Homer-Marge relationship crisis, but it is also a meta-episode. They are revisiting a decade we already saw The Simpsons living in. Instead of being vague about the time period, like other teens-era examples, they specifically went for the 1990s. And boy did they lean into it. That 90s Show is just as much about the 90s themselves as it is about their relationship. Let's contrast this with their previous flashbacks, like I Married Marge and Lisa's First Word. Those certainly showed off the time period and indulgently leaned into the nostalgia. They sing You Light Up My Life, Mr. Burns plays Pac-Man in his office, and Krusty learns an expensive Cold War lesson. Oh look, it's Webster! But these were always flavor elements of the plot. Nothing about Homer's struggle to find work and support his wife is dependent on the specific time period. Same with their early years raising Bart and his jealousy toward his baby sister. These do a wonderful job of painting that picture of living in the 1980s, but making the story beats feel timeless and universal. That you could imagine being like Homer, working a crappy fast food job in the 80s. That 90s Show very aggressively runs in the opposite direction of this philosophy. Almost everything about Homer's journey is rooted in the time period. Like, okay, laser tag is still around, I'll give you that one. But doing this Boys to Men homage, and then pivoting to a full-blown Nirvana parody, is clearly indicating that it wants to do cultural commentary as well as relationship drama. Not only did the writers float the timeline, they're shoving it in our faces. I talked about this in the Millennial video, but it bears repeating again. That 90s Show did not establish the Simpsons floating timeline. As far back as stuff like Lisa's First Word, and especially Lisa's sax, we saw the years creep forward. I mean, that episode has Homer watching Twin Peaks, putting this in 1990, a time when The Simpsons was airing. It's already anachronistic. But there was a long layover before they did another time period specific flashback. Doing That 90s Show a decade later ended up being quite the shock to the system. And many Simpsons fans weren't ready for it. Basically, Matt Selman pushed us all into the Simpsons continuity pool and told us to swim. There remains the question of, why bother doing this exercise? Why satirize a decade The Simpsons already spent a decade satirizing in real time? That 90s Show feels like a nostalgia play, junk food for an aging Simpsons audience. Any 90s cultural commentary gets especially messy for The Simpsons, given The Simpsons' own direct influence on the decade. There is no Melrose Place on Fox without The Simpsons. This series doing 90s commentary does feel masturbatory, watching them comment on a culture they helped foster. That said, to be fair, That 90s Show does go out of its way to hit up cultural topics this show hadn't addressed before. Classic Simpsons never had Bart and Milhouse playing laser tag, they weren't collecting Beanie Babies, and they certainly never mentioned grunge. Grunge was past its heyday by the time Homer Palooza came out. If they had done a Nirvana parody joke, like in Season 3, I don't even think the fans would have been that receptive to it, since the reference wasn't like 2 decades old. I think there is value in having that sense of distance, to look back at events from 15 years ago. Why is an episode from 1991 allowed to satirize the mid-70s, but a 2008 episode can't go back to the early 90s? Come on. Conceptually, I can't really fault that 90s show for what it did. It actually kind of pisses me off even more, that I want to be grumpy about this. But it's so logically sound, given the rules of Simpsons continuity, that Matt Selman is the kind of mad lad who thinks about this stuff, that I kind of respect it. Like, I'm angrily shaking my fists while figuring out why. As for the execution of these ideas, I've laid out some of the perils of The Simpsons doing such a 90s-driven story, but we'll go into that more in the next few sections. Now, let's talk about whether this plot actually works. You know what'll make the fans happy? Pairing a sudden timeline shift with a Homer-Marge relationship crisis story, in an era chock full of relationship crises. Man, it's like this thing was engineered to get under the skin of internet message board users. Now conceptually, this isn't a terrible idea, as several previous flashbacks demonstrated, but the concept is getting long in the tooth at this point in Simpsons history. This show loves love triangles. That 90s show needs to demonstrate that it has a fresh take on this dynamic to make this worthwhile. I like their choice to send Marge to college, that this becomes their central conflict. Not only does it make Marge a fish out of water, a dynamic she excels at, it puts Homer in a familiar yet likable role. Good news, internet fans, there isn't even one drop of jerk-ass Homer in this thing. They play him just right in the first half, demonstrating how he wants to support Marge so she can spread her wings, but not being able to relate to it. There's a little bit of that hardworking Lisa's Pony Homer, as well as that oblivious and disinterested streetcar Homer. I love the portrayal of her as that bright-eyed college freshman, whose mind is being blown by the idea of history being written by the winners. It's so quaint and adorable and perfect for her. She's so naive and idealistic that a lecherous lecturer like Professor August would notice her. Now, I gotta be upfront here. I absolutely hate Professor August. This guy gets under my skin so much that I kinda dislike watching the episode just because of him. They made him that much of a smug, self-satisfied douche. And it's not even the political angle, the look at this pretentious leftist spraying over the founding fathers. Like, there's obviously room to joke around about these energetic professors ready to blow their students' minds, shit-talking the famous dead white dudes. College is full of these guys. The stereotype exists for a reason. Like, okay, it's not exactly subtle here. Professor August is practically a Mr. Burcham character. He's such a paper-thin caricature. It says something about how reviled this episode is, that even the anti-woke crowd hasn't championed this thing. However, I do like the concept of him as that first professor to open Marge's eyes to new ideas. I think many college students can relate to this moment, whether you are in the sciences, the humanities, business, whatever, finding a new passion. It gives this character a psychological advantage over Marge, that she looks up to him so much. This is exactly how so many unethical teachers take advantage of their students. This guy is wooing her with his progressive ideas while manipulating his way into her pants. The problem is that his manipulations are almost too effortless. Marge is immediately fawning over this guy like he's Indiana Jones. And there's not much substance to Marge's newfound love of college in general. It's not like a Lisa story, full of scenes where she's prancing around in her exciting new world. She doesn't even have any personal chemistry with this dude. It's just played as Marge being mind-screwed, with Marge offering very little resistance. There isn't much to her conflict with Homer, him not understanding her newfound love of college. Do you love college, Marge? Because it kind of feels like you just love hanging out in his office. That's all we get to see. Maybe that's what gets me about this plotline. That this conflict is so stupid, and Professor August gets away with it because Marge is so swept up by everything. Later, they do demonstrate that the two don't suit each other well on a personal level. He's getting overly emotional, petulantly demanding whale sounds, and interviewing her before going in for the kiss. It's interesting how Marge's dating history has Artie Ziff with his busy hands, Professor August, the step-by-step consent guy, and Homer, who understands when the time is right. It's like Goldilocks and the 3 bears of consent. In the end, that 90s show doesn't know how to get rid of this guy since he has so thoroughly mind-screwed Marge, so they just have him act like a douche at the beach and let Marge see his true colors. Now, I like the ideological split over the concept of marriage. This does feel like a substantial issue for them and flows with the foundation of their relationship. But instead, they add in this line to further demonstrate what an insensitive Diggi is. I like the hypocrisy angle, showing he doesn't really respect women, but it's a cheap way to get rid of him. They even make fun of this approach in the ending. I'm left wondering what Marge actually learned, other than, oops, that guy was the worst. Professor August is too much of a caricature, and Marge is too gullible. It's just annoying to sit through. At least the Homer plotline has songs. Oh boy, let's talk sadgasm. It's interesting that for such a 90s heavy episode, the most 90s aspect of the plot is entirely reactionary to the main storyline. Homer gets to do his Nirvana parody because he's that disenchanted by life now. I don't mind this pivot from a plot logic or characterization standpoint. Homer has always been musically inclined and has the kind of personality that would wallow in his pain for quite some time. This makes total sense as an outlet for his feelings. Personally, I'm impressed that he was able to get Lenny and Carl and Lou to change genres so easily. As for the actual song parodies themselves, well, it's a mixed bag. I've never been a fan of this first number, with the whole Kingdom of Numb, feelings are dumb stuff. Like, okay guys, we get it. Grunge music is full of cynicism and nihilism. You've made your point. Maybe the idea is that there is no subtlety to Homer's lyricism. It just feels like they're hitting us over the head with the concept here. I much prefer his other 2 songs, Shave Me and Margarine. I think the direct parodies read more clearly, and there's more of Homer's personality in the lyrics. Also, it's kinda crazy that The Simpsons are parodying this song in particular. Wow. And Margarine is just straight up good wordplay. I absolutely love Weird Al's parody and Homer's quote about him afterward. Probably the best line of the whole episode. The sadgasm stuff takes quite a beating from the fans, but there is some funny stuff in here. It's just so damn on the nose, and so surface level. That 90s show doesn't really have anything to say about grunge, just a general observation about its angsty nihilism. It's more nostalgia junk food. Furthermore, I don't think the sadgasm plot complements Marge's arc at all. It exists to give Homer an outlet and allow Marge to recognize what she means to him, but this was never really what this story was about. Homer was extremely devoted to Marge, even if he couldn't connect with her college interests. The main conflict was the whole townie versus college student dynamic. So the reconciliation should be related to that theme, of Marge appreciating and valuing their differences. You could also argue that Marge should have already realized how manipulated she was by her professor. The story doesn't need Homer to reach these lows to achieve that goal. Here's my least favorite aspect of the episode, looking back on it all these years later. And I realize this is a strange argument for me to make, as I am too young to fully grasp Nirvana's influence. But I really dislike this plot point, this fake-out overdose joke. That they went there with this Kurt Cobain parody. Like, okay, let's do all this Nirvana stuff, the songs, whatever. But the end of Cobain's life was a genuine tragedy, and using this as a plot point feels in really poor taste. I think you can do the deeply depressed artist hates being famous angle without going this far. Maybe I'm being overly sensitive about this. It's not like they played this completely straight. Just the more I think about it, the more screwed up it feels that The Simpsons parodied this event. Imagine if in Homer's Barbershop Quartet that Barney gets shot by some guy in the street. It's a weird thing to include in your silly music parody. I think you could have easily done this Homer-Marge relationship story in the 90s without going all Homer's Barbershop Quartet all over it. And even that one was more of a quirky spin on a music story. This one literally implies that Sadgasm influenced Nirvana and grunge in general. I guess if The Simpsons influenced the 90s, may as well do an episode where The Simpsons influenced the 90s. To make a long story short, the whole sense of continuity has become really weird. And now, a dramatic reading. You know what? The Simpsons is one of the only shows on television that thinks it can get away with this kind of ridiculous nonsense. Why? Because people are too afraid to point out the inherent problem with this episode, because of fears of being an embodiment of comic book guy. Pointing out a minor continuity problem just feels so nerdy, and that would make you the kind of person the staff makes fun of. But this episode isn't like Itchy hitting the same xylophone rib twice with 2 different results. It flies in the face of several episodes and essentially rewrites the main characters' histories. And it's not like the show was trying to make a pointed meta-argument about the time-frozen series. At least episodes like the Poochie episode and The Principal and the Pauper have that aspect going for them. Being about a meta-argument and causing a meta-argument are 2 totally different things. Can anyone imagine if they did this kind of nonsense on a show like Lost or 24? The fans would go nuts. Even the fans of 24, who are used to gaping plot holes by now, they wouldn't get away with it. And, as mentioned before, the only reason The Simpsons think they can is because of the whole internet fanboy mentality. Someone needs to remind the writers that The Simpsons has been on TV for almost 2 decades now. It's a little too late to pretend like it's season 1. Don't screw with the foundation of the series just because you can't think of anywhere else to go with the characters. That should be a serious sign that it's nearing the time to put the show to rest. If the writers are bored with the show's established history, then they should start a new series. Seriously, you can't have it both ways. There's a reason why so many long-running TV shows ended, you know. Keeping the show fresh doesn't mean you have to sacrifice the narrative integrity of the series. End nerd rant. So, let's talk about continuity and The Simpsons' quote-unquote narrative integrity. In terms of the timeline, that 90s show places itself between the events of The Way We Was and I Married Marge. At the very beginning, they go out of their way to justify this placement, that given Homer, Marge, and Bart's ages, there is a gap of time after high school that we knew nothing about. In addition, that 90s show very deliberately gives us this moment at the end, after they reunite. There's that old green car and them joining the Castle Club. This scene is not an accident. Clearly it is there to merge the 2 stories together. Based on this, we could surmise that Homer didn't want or need his music career anymore, took a job at the mini golf course, and Marge got pregnant shortly afterward. So, what's the problem here? Why does that 90s show mess up Simpsons continuity? It seems to me that the writers did make an effort to make it fit, which is what we, the fans, are always pestering them to do. Now you could argue that it becomes historically strange that Homer had an incredibly influential music career, tossed it aside, and later became successful with his barbershop quartet. Yeah, that's a weird trajectory. But as Simpsons fans, we acknowledge that it's obviously impossible for any real person to do everything Homer Simpson has. We're used to how silly their list of achievements are. To quote another season 19 episode, none of these things ever really happened. The only thing that 90s show changes about I Married Marge is the trappings of the time period, that maybe they didn't go see The Empire Strikes Back before conceiving Bart. But this is just the nature of the floating timeline, as we discussed in part 1. So the conclusion I come to is that 90s show didn't break anything about their backstory. It's just a time-shifted prequel to I Married Marge. Compare this to something like Season 33's Mothers and Other Strangers, which did rewrite Homer's backstory in Mother Simpson by showing he knew Mona was alive the entire time. Or Camp Krustier, that rewrote the final act of Camp Krusty. That 90s show looks downright quaint compared to those. So, why are we so mad at That 90s Show? Why were fans having 2-minute hates and writing these bitter diatribes about the narrative integrity of the series? Well, I have a confession. The person who wrote that diatribe was me, back in 2008. Yes, I'm old now, leave me alone. Oh, little Jimmy, you were so fiery back then, and hadn't been beaten down yet by Simpsons continuity. Now, this post didn't matter, and I don't even remember if anyone even replied to it. It's one of 100 angry posts by random people about the episode. I find it really cringe now how butthurt I was about it at the time, and actually put off doing this video because I was that embarrassed. But I think about it sometimes, when working on this YouTube channel, about how worked up we get about our faves. That 90s Show really was a shock to the system for Simpsons fans. I don't think we were ready for this being thrown at us. Saying this is a time-shifted prequel to I Married Marge might make sense now, but it is a really strange thing to wrap your mind around. At the time, we had become like Grandpa, where the show's experiments had become weird and scary to us. Maybe deep down, this episode made us feel old. Ironically, today, I have landed in the exact opposite camp as before. I really think that the whole 90s aspect of That 90s Show is overblown in regards to Sadgasm, the floating timeline, and Homer and Marge's backstory. I think it's clear that the writers did care about the internal logic of the show, and gave us enough indications to explain why it works. I don't think That 90s Show should be considered the worst episode ever because of the 90s. My biggest issues are with its execution. I think Marge and Homer's individual plot lines work okay in a vacuum, but don't mesh well. Homer's story is entirely a reaction to Marge's, and isn't thematically linked enough to provide a satisfying change of heart. Marge is written a little too gullible that their conflict is more frustrating than compelling. Professor August plays the heel too well that I hate watching him. Sadgasm in general falls into the inherent problems of The Simpsons satirizing a decade they directly influenced. That instead of Homer being influenced by his environment, now he's influencing Nirvana. Like, I love this Back to the Future joke, but it is indicative of how The Simpsons had changed. Him being in Sadgasm makes their journey way less timeless, which is a huge component of why previous flashback stories worked. The only part of my old post that I fully agree with now is that there is something sweaty about That 90s Show. That this is the kind of experiment only done by shows that are bored out of its mind. That maybe That 90s Show is why series shouldn't run for 20 years. Why are we making them twist themselves into pretzels just to find a fresh take? Personally, I've always taken the stance that I'd rather have the show try something weird and fail than churn out something safe and boring. That's why I've been a big proponent of what they've been doing in the past few seasons. I think they should be doing stuff like That 90s Show. But if you look at it and say, this is why the show should have been canceled, that they resorted to this, I can't really argue with you. I can't. It's a perfectly logical take. It's a question of how many increasingly weird Simpsons evolutions you really need in your life. Maybe this was too far. Personally, I don't think That 90s Show is the worst episode ever. Rating it today, I would probably give it a 2 out of 5. I think it's just below average, in the lower quartile of the whole series. Maybe bottom 100? I would never put it in the category with Codependence Day, The Boy's a Bummer, and stuff like that. They had an innovative idea that we weren't quite ready for, and the story doesn't quite work. Let me know in the comments whether you think it's still one of the worst ever, or if you've softened on it over time. I have seen defenses of this thing, as well as the brutal takedowns. For me, That 90s Show is an interesting but fundamentally flawed experiment.